I've been through a kind of hell I wouldn't wish on anyone, but I wouldn't change a thing, because if I had, I wouldn't have the life I have today. I nearly lost everything, but in my darkest hour, something unexpected happened. Someone walked into my life who changed it forever. I'm sitting here on the couch, staring into the soft, flickering light of the fireplace, a glass of whiskey resting in my hand. It's New Year's Eve, and I can hear my wife humming along to the mellow music playing from the speakers as she arranges the gifts. Our kids are older now, teenagers, but we've still kept up the tradition of giving them gifts on New Year's morning. The toys have been replaced with gadgets, books, and clothes, but the love behind them remains unchanged. I glance over at her, and just like it happens so often, she catches my gaze at the exact same time. Our eyes meet, and we exchange a warm, familiar smile. My thoughts drift back to a different New Year's Eve, one from long ago, and even further to another a few years before that, a time when a series of both good and bad events led me to meet Sophie, the woman who would become my partner and eventually my wife. People say that sometimes you have to walk through hell to reach heaven, and in my case, that couldn't be truer. I went through a kind of hell I wouldn't wish on anyone, but if I hadn't, I wouldn't have Sophie by my side, and I wouldn't be the man I am today. Let me share my story with you because there's something to be learned from it. As far as I know, throughout history, there's only ever been one perfect man, and even he was more than just a man. So, it stands to reason that every one of us has messed up at some point in life, doing something that caused pain to someone else. We've all made choices, ones that could have easily earned us some serious judgment, at least from higher powers. But by grace, we don't always have to face the consequences of our foolish decisions. In my case, I led someone down a path they'd never been on before. I introduced Rachel Thompson to marijuana right after high school, and from that one reckless moment, she spiraled into addiction and self-destruction. Things might not have been so bad, except that not long after, she got pregnant. We ended up getting married, and she gave me 3 kids in the span of 4 years, 2 daughters and a son. It wasn't until nearly 8 years into the marriage that I fully understood who she'd become right under my nose. I lost most of my savings and all of my dignity before I finally managed to free myself from that situation. And even then, she left me with scars, some you can see and some you can't, that I carry with me to this day. My name is John Harris, and I'm 44 now, a lot smarter than I was at 20. I grew up in the suburbs of a mid-sized city in the Pacific Northwest. My parents were doing well enough financially, and I tried hard to fit in and seem cool. I was on the football team throughout high school, although I mostly played special teams on junior varsity. That didn't stop me from smoking cigarettes, drinking beer, or getting high. That was just the way things were back then. You'd think losing a close friend during my senior year of high school would have set us straight. And for a little while, it did for me. It was during that time of reflection that I started dating Rachel. We were in a class together, and she kind of latched onto me, seeing that I was someone in need. It didn't seem to matter that she had a boyfriend already, a guy who was a year ahead of us and attending the local community college. Rachel and I started seeing each other, and before long, she left him for me. That should have been a red flag, but I was too caught up in my feelings to notice. Back then, Rachel was more of a band geek, but she was the affectionate type, as they say. She was a little taller than most and quite attractive, with everything in the right places. She had a thing about her nose, it had a slight crook to it, but it never took away from her looks. Her hair was a plain, soft brown, nothing that stood out, but that was Rachel. For the most part, she was a sweet girl, the youngest child of a truck driver and a schoolteacher. But not everyone took a liking to her. My father, in particular, was one of those people. Even before she got involved with drugs, Rachel could be moody, and when she was in one of her bad moods, she could really be a handful. I didn't mind too much because, if I'm being honest, I could be a tough person to deal with when I was in a bad mood too. Even my mom, who liked Rachel and understood her, recognized the potential dangers of 2 people like us getting together. I think my dad could sense that there were darker things lurking inside her, things that could drag me down if they ever came to light. And to be honest, he thought I could do a lot better. But I was head over heels in love, and besides, my dad always said he married below his station, too, yet my mom turned out to be a wonderful woman, a real gem of a person. Who knows where our relationship would have gone if I hadn't gone off to college and come back for Thanksgiving break with a renewed love for weed. The first day I got home, a Tuesday morning, Rachel's parents were out at work, and she greeted me at the door in nothing but a thin nightgown. We hadn't seen each other in months, and both of us were pretty eager to be together. But instead of jumping right in, I convinced her to throw on some clothes and go for a ride with me. We had this perfect parking spot we used before, so I drove us there. Once we were parked, I pulled out a fat joint. She gave me a bit of a disapproving look, but I could tell she was curious. After all, I had hinted at it plenty of times before. So, she decided to give it a shot. Pretty soon, she was giggling uncontrollably. And then, out of nowhere, she kissed me with a passion I had never seen from her before. We'd been close before, but she always seemed to be holding something back, not this time. She kissed me like her life depended on it, and in a matter of seconds, we were tearing at each other's clothes like we couldn't wait. Now, getting busy in the back seat of a car isn't the most comfortable thing in the world, but it sure was exciting. We were both drenched in sweat and laughing like crazy as we came down from the high of it all. I quickly realized that we'd had the same effect on Rachel as it did on me. It made her endlessly affectionate, and we were inseparable the entire weekend, spending every moment we could together until I had to leave on Sunday. When I came back for Christmas break, we did the same thing, though finding private time and space wasn't always easy. But it wasn't all fun and games. As the holiday break dragged on, we started having more friction between us. Rachel was so affectionate and so quick to give in that I couldn't help but wonder what she might be doing when I was away at college. When we weren't getting high and being close, we were getting into arguments, and I could tell we were probably headed for a breakup, that is, until fate stepped in. I'd been back at school for about a month when Rachel called me in tears. She told me her period was late. She had quietly gone to a clinic, and the doctor confirmed what she feared most: she was pregnant. Neither of us was particularly religious back then, but we didn't believe in abortion, so after talking it over, we decided to get married. It goes without saying that our parents weren't thrilled, especially my dad, who practically begged me not to go through with it. But I felt like it was the right thing to do, the responsible and honorable choice. So, in June of 1985, we got married. Much later, after our daughter, Sarah, was born, I did the math and realized Rachel must have conceived right around New Year's Day. I ended up doing the same calculation with our other two kids as well. With a wife and kids to take care of, finishing college was no longer an option, so I found a job at a local pharmacy, stocking shelves and running the register from time to time. If it were today, I probably wouldn't have gotten that job since I wouldn't have passed a drug test, but back then, drug screenings weren't standard practice. And as it turned out, I was pretty good at the job. After 2 years on the job, I was promoted to assistant store manager at another location across town. In 1988, Rachel gave birth to our son, Jason. A year later, we welcomed our second daughter, Emma. After that, Rachel had her tubes tied, and we settled into raising our growing family. During this time, we still partied, but nothing too out of control. We'd smoke weed pretty regularly, and on occasion, we'd splurge on some coke, hash, or LSD. Rachel really enjoyed how some of those drugs made her feel, and she was always eager to indulge, especially since it made us incredibly affectionate with each other. But as the kids started getting older, I found myself moving away from the harder stuff. And as my responsibilities at work increased, I gradually let that part of my life fade away. I honestly thought Rachel had done the same. I want to make it clear that I loved her through all of this, even when things got a bit rough at home. It was around the fall of 1991, when Emma was 3 and Jason was 4, that Rachel decided to go back to work. She landed a job as a secretary for a mid-sized electrical contracting company. At first, I didn't mind. After all, the extra income was helpful with the expenses of a growing family. But as I met some of the people she was working with, I started to get a bad feeling, especially about some of the men she worked alongside. To put it bluntly, a lot of them were sleazy types, and a couple of them I knew were pretty deep into drugs. Then there was Rachel's friend, Cindy, who had gotten her the job in the first place. Cindy was married to a guy named Frank, who was a low-level dealer and the go-to guy whenever we needed a hookup. Their marriage was a mess. They were always fighting, cheating on each other, and I even suspected they were into swinging, though I never got involved in any of that. Frank was all right most of the time, but once he got a little too much whiskey in him, he could turn into a real nightmare. So, I kept my distance. But Rachel and Cindy hit it off fast, so we spent a lot of time hanging out at their place. The first time I really started to suspect something might be going on with Rachel was that New Year's Eve. We went to a big party at Frank and Cindy's place, the usual year-end blowout, plenty of beer, plenty of smoke. I hadn't touched weed in about 6 weeks, so it hit me harder than usual. I was doing all right until just after midnight when the champagne started flowing. I ended up polishing off most of a bottle on top of a dozen or so beers, and that's when it all went south. I got sick as a dog, and I remember sitting outside on the driveway, completely out of it, in the freezing cold. Rachel eventually found me after I had been out there puking my guts out. She helped me inside and laid me down on a bed where I passed out. I must have been out cold for a couple of hours because the next thing I remember is one of their teenage daughters waking me up and telling me to get out of her room. I stumbled out, looking for Rachel, but she was nowhere to be found. I thought I heard some muffled noises coming from one of the back bedrooms, but I was too far gone to check it out. Before I knew it, it was morning. I woke up on the floor in their den, and Rachel was asleep on the couch. That night was a turning point for me. I made a promise to myself that I wouldn't put myself in that kind of situation again. I had a solid career ahead of me, and I could tell society's attitude was shifting away from casual drug use. It was the height of the "Just Say No" campaign, and stories about the dangers of drugs were everywhere. I cut way back on drinking and almost completely stopped smoking weed. I quit keeping it around the house, and over the course of the next year, I managed to wean myself off of it entirely. I genuinely thought Rachel was on the same page, but it started to dawn on me that she had only stopped using at home. The first real sign that something was shifting came in the spring. One day, Rachel went to get her hair done and returned home as a blonde. I also noticed she was shedding some of the weight she'd gained after the kids, but I didn't see her following any kind of diet or exercise plan that would explain it. Along with the weight loss and new hair color, which, honestly, I wasn't a fan of, she started wearing more revealing outfits. When I finally brought it up, she just shrugged it off, saying something about wanting to look good for work. It didn't sit right with me. As spring gave way to summer, Rachel started going out with her girlfriends a couple of nights a week after work, and she began coming home later and later. After these nights out, she'd try to sneak in quietly, lock herself in the bathroom, and immediately take a shower. Meanwhile, our intimate life had come to a complete halt. At the time, it worried me. Later on, I'd actually be grateful for it. Then, in mid-July, she came home around 2 o'clock in the morning, and I pretended to be asleep while watching her. I saw her slip off her dress, and I was stunned to realize she had been completely naked underneath. That was the first undeniable sign that made me suspect she was cheating. The next morning, I confronted her about it, and she looked me square in the eye and denied everything. "Of course I'm not having an affair," she said, offended. "Are you?" "Not even close," I shot back, but her reaction told me all I needed to know. She was flipping my suspicions back on me, making herself the victim. I knew I'd stayed faithful, even though there had been times when I was tempted by some of the women I worked with. But I knew that was a dangerous road to go down, so I always steered clear of those situations. It wasn't that I was some saint who wouldn't have been with another woman if the opportunity presented itself. It had more to do with my personality. I never had the gift of smooth-talking women, especially strangers. I felt comfortable with Rachel, and the thought of stepping outside of that comfort zone to pursue someone else just wasn't something I was capable of. At home, things were growing colder between us. We'd go through phases where things were civil, but more often than not, we were disconnected. Our intimacy was non-existent, and the playful banter we used to have early in our marriage had vanished. I also started getting on her case when she came home late with bloodshot eyes and the lingering smell of marijuana on her. But again, she turned it around on me, saying she was old enough to make her own decisions, reminding me that I was the one who introduced her to weed in the first place. If I wasn't willing to party with her anymore, she said, she'd find someone else who would. By the end of September, I made a last-ditch effort to save our relationship. I caught Rachel on one of her days off, sat her down, and we had a heart-to-heart. I told her I knew she was smoking a lot more than she used to, and I suspected she was into harder stuff too. I asked her straight up if she still loved me and if she still wanted to stay married. Tears filled her eyes as she said she did. "All right, then here's the deal," I said. "I want you to quit that job and find something else. I think you should look into a rehab program, and we need to see a marriage counselor. I'm willing to put everything behind us, but only if you're willing to meet me halfway." "I don't know, Mike," she replied. "I make good money at that job, and I like it there. They treat me well, and I'm definitely not going to rehab. I get if you don't want to do this anymore, but I'm not ready to stop. I'm not an addict or anything. I can handle it." Rachel agreed to meet with a counselor, and we went twice. But after that, she decided it was a waste of time and money we didn't have, so she quit going. After that, her reckless behavior picked right back up. I started following her to the bars she'd hit after work, where she drank with a mix of men and women. Some of the places she ended up were pretty rough. I didn't hang around long enough to see if she was sneaking off to motels or anything because I had to get home and take care of the kids. But a couple of times, I saw her disappear toward the back of the bar, near the restrooms, and stay back there far longer than I thought was necessary. By December, I had gathered enough circumstantial evidence to know I needed something solid. At that point, our marriage was nothing but a joke. We were constantly fighting, and she was coming home late from work almost every other night, looking like she'd been through the ringer. I'd had enough of Rachel and her string of lies and what I believed were infidelities. What made it worse was how she had completely abandoned her role as a mother. She spent her time running around, partying, while I did the lion's share of the parenting. The kids weren't blind to it either, they noticed. I needed to find out what was really going on so I could figure out my next move. Was there any chance of salvaging our marriage, or was it time to pull the plug and go for a divorce? I took 3 initial steps. First, I scheduled a checkup with my doctor. While I was there, I requested a blood test. I wanted to confirm 2 things, that I didn't have any sexually transmitted diseases, and that I could show I was completely drug-free. Next, I quietly collected DNA samples from all 3 of our children and sent them to a lab out of state. I needed undeniable proof of whether or not I was their biological father. DNA testing wasn't as advanced back then as it is now, but it was accurate enough to answer the question. I didn't think it would change my love for them. I was their dad, no matter what, but from a legal standpoint, I needed to know. If we ended up in a divorce, I wanted custody, and my chances would be better if I could prove I was their biological father. Lastly, I asked around and got the name of the best divorce lawyer in town. I went to see him and laid out all of my concerns. He agreed to take my case and referred me to a private investigator named David Larson. David was a no-nonsense guy in his early 40s, and I quickly learned he knew everything and everyone in town. I told him what I needed, and he got to work. The whole thing was already costing me a small fortune, and I still didn't have anything solid to go on. It all came to a head on Christmas Eve. Her company had a tradition of closing early, around 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and throwing a big party for the employees in their warehouse. I figured Rachel would hang out for a couple of hours, then come home so we could wrap up our last-minute shopping and get the Christmas gifts ready for the kids. But 6 p.m. came and went, and there was no sign of her. By 9 p.m., she still wasn't home. I started calling everyone I could think of, Monica, who was also nowhere to be found, the jails, the hospitals, but there was no trace of Rachel. I was furious. Even on Christmas Eve, she couldn't rein in her behavior. I was still up, pacing around the house at 10:30 when I heard a car door slam. I looked out the window and saw my wife stumbling up the walkway. She spotted me standing there, and her face just fell. She tried to push past me, but I stopped her, and the smell hit me like a ton of bricks. She reeked of sweat and sex. To make matters worse, she had dried semen in her hair, and her eyes were glazed over, like she'd spent the day getting high. I just stared at her, and she couldn't even meet my eyes. Something inside me just crumbled in that moment. I was too exhausted to even argue. Besides, I already knew the full story. Soon, I'd have video evidence of her entire day. I'd had a gut feeling she'd pull something like this, so I had David set up surveillance. By then, he had already uncovered that Rachel had been spotted frequenting a shady motel on the rough side of town, hanging out with some unsavory types. David had bribed a clerk there, and they'd agreed to let him install a hidden camera in one of the rooms. If Rachel showed up, she'd be directed to that specific room. We spent Christmas Day in a tense, silent standoff, barely speaking to each other. I was just waiting for the storm to hit, knowing it was coming. Rachel was off work for the next week since her company always closed down between Christmas and New Year's, so I wasn't as concerned about her running off anywhere. The day after Christmas, though, David called me at work, and I could hear the urgency in his voice. "You need to come see the tape from the other day," he said. "How bad is it?" I asked. "Worse than you could ever imagine," he replied. I had suspected Rachel might have a boyfriend, maybe even two, but nothing could have prepared me for what I was about to see on that tape. David had me sit down in an empty office, popped the tape into the VCR, and left me alone to take it all in. Before starting the tape, he handed me a surveillance report detailing Rachel's behavior leading up to her arrival at the motel. Honestly, the report alone was enough. It was pretty graphic. I'm not sure how David pulled it off, but he managed to get one of his associates into Rachel's company party, so there were eyewitness accounts of what went down. It started off like any typical holiday party, a lot of drinking, some flirting under the mistletoe, nothing out of the ordinary. But after about an hour, the Christmas music on the stereo got swapped out for dance tracks, and that's when things took a turn. Rachel was seen dancing provocatively with a number of people, including her friend Cindy. According to the report, Rachel and Cindy all but had sex right there in the middle of the room, while the guys gathered around, egging them on. Then things got really wild. Rachel was seen heading out to the parking lot with some guy. The PI positioned himself so he could see what they were up to. First, they lit up a joint, and while they were smoking, the guy pulled out a vial of coke. They shared several spoonfuls of it. Then the guy leaned back, and Rachel's head disappeared into his lap. The PI could see the guy's head tilt back in obvious pleasure. A few minutes later, Rachel came up, wiping her mouth with a grin on her face, and they both headed back inside. The party wrapped up around 5 p.m., but instead of coming home, Rachel followed a few trucks to that motel she'd been seen at before. That's where the tape started. My wife, soon-to-be ex-wife, walked into that motel room with 4 guys who looked tough, rugged. They were all tall, around 6 feet, muscular, and a couple of them could even be considered handsome if you liked men with a rough edge. They lit up 3 joints, passing them around, while one of the men sat down and started cutting several thick lines of coke. As the room filled with smoke, each of them, including Rachel, snorted a line up both nostrils. She giggled seductively after taking her hit. Then the real action started. What I saw on that tape made anything I'd ever heard about look tame in comparison. Rachel's performance with those guys was something straight out of a professional-level film. I'd seen more than enough, but I fast-forwarded through the tape just to solidify in my mind how bad things had gotten. And somehow, it got even worse. By that point, though, I was too numb to feel any more shock. So when she ended up with all four of them at once, it didn't even hit me as hard as it should have. I must have had quite the look on my face because David had his associate, the one who had followed Rachel at the party, take me to a nearby bar for a drink. After a couple of beers with Mike Johnson, I started to feel a little better. We talked about what my next steps were going to be, and Mike offered to help out when the time came to serve Rachel with the divorce papers. He was a big, muscular guy, but underneath it all, he had a soft heart, and I could tell he felt for me. Mike had been through something similar in his past, so he understood exactly what I was going through. That night, it took everything I had to stay civil when I got home. Luckily, Rachel made it easier by getting dressed up and heading out with her friends. I didn't even bother to watch her leave. I just stayed in the den, playing with Sarah, while she walked out the door. The next morning, I went to my lawyer and told him I was ready to file. I wanted the papers drawn up in time for New Year's Eve, and I specifically requested that Mike be the one to serve her. I had a New Year's surprise in store for my soon-to-be ex-wife. I told Rachel that I'd be working until 9 p.m. on New Year's Eve and that I'd rather spend a quiet evening at home. I even asked her to stay home with me, knowing full well she wouldn't. She, of course, had already planned to go to Monica and Carl's big year-end party, and she laughed at what she thought was a pathetic attempt to guilt her into staying. "If you want to be boring, be my guest," she said, "but I'm ready to party. Can't you at least stick around long enough to watch the kids until I get home from work?" I asked. "Why?" she shot back, her voice dripping with disdain. "Why should I let those little rugrats ruin my fun? If you can't tear yourself away from your precious store, I'll just hire a sitter." Her cold indifference floored me. I knew she had lost interest in parenting, but hearing her talk about the kids that way hit me like a punch to the gut. It made what was about to happen that much more unbelievable. "That's fine, Rachel," I said slowly. "I'll take care of everything. You don't have to lift a finger for your kids." I called our neighbor's teenage daughter, the kid's usual sitter, and asked her to come by for about an hour. She agreed, and I told her to call the store as soon as Rachel left. A little after 6:30, the call came in. I handed the store over to my assistant and called my brother, who had agreed to meet me at the house to help pack up Rachel's things. His wife drove him over, and she took the kids to spend the night at their grandparents'. We packed up all of Rachel's belongings and loaded them into my pickup, then took everything to a storage unit. After that, we headed to Carl and Monica's place, arriving a little after 10 o'clock. Mike was already there, parked in a secure spot, keeping an eye on the house. "She hasn't left," Mike said as I walked up. "Looks like she's in for the night." "Good," I replied as he handed me a cup of coffee from the thermos he had with him. We sat and watched as people came and went from the house. Midnight rolled around, and the sound of fireworks and celebrations erupted all around us. That's when the three of us got out and approached the house. At first, no one answered the door, probably couldn't hear us over the noise. But Mike pounded on it until finally, someone I didn't recognize opened it. "Rachel Turner." Mike's booming voice echoed as we stepped into the foyer. It took a few minutes for someone to drag her to the door, and when she finally appeared, she looked completely wasted. "Yeah, what?" she slurred, then her eyes landed on me and my brother standing on either side of Mike. I think the look on our faces made it clear we weren't there to join the party. "What are you?" she started to say, but Mike cut her off. "Rachel Turner," he said, thrusting a letter into her hand, "you've been served. This is a petition filed in civil court by Mr. Mark Turner, seeking a divorce on the grounds of adultery and mental cruelty. Additionally, this is an injunction preventing you from coming within 1,500 feet of the residence you once shared with your husband. Inside this envelope is the key and address to the storage facility where your belongings have been moved. You sorry son of a, Rachel began, but I could see Carl, Monica, and the rest of their friends gathering behind her, curious about the scene. I gave you a chance, Rachel, I said calmly. I gave you the opportunity to straighten out, and you chose to cheat on me. Now, you can live with the consequences. The crowd behind her started getting rowdy, voices rising in anger. Mike, ever the professional, calmly opened his jacket, revealing the pistol tucked into his waistband. He rested his hand on the grip and stared down the onlookers. Then, without another word, we turned and walked out, the doors slamming shut behind us. I doubted Mike would have ever drawn that pistol, but its presence had certainly done the trick. Afterward, I headed to my parents' house to spend what was left of New Year's Eve and brace myself for the battle that was sure to come. And it didn't take long. Rachel had started making a mess of things almost immediately, and what followed turned into the year from hell. While we had been packing up Rachel's things, I'd hired a locksmith to come by and change all the locks. But that didn't stop her. While we were spending New Year's Day at my parents' place, she broke a window in the kitchen door to get into the house. From the looks of things, she tore through the bedroom, probably searching for something, but I didn't care what. I called the cops, and she was charged with breaking and entering. Since it was her first offense and considering the circumstances surrounding me serving her the night before, her lawyer managed to get the charges dropped. About a week later, I got my blood test results back from the doctor, and I let out a sigh of relief when everything came up clean. I added those documents to the growing pile of evidence. Then, a week after that, the DNA results arrived. All 3 kids were mine, no doubt about it. Whatever Rachel had been up to, she hadn't started until after our children were born. That made my next move clear. I was going for full custody and only allowing her supervised visitation. To my surprise, Rachel fought me every step of the way. You'd think with the way she'd been acting, she'd be happy to have her freedom, no husband or family holding her back from whatever wild life she wanted. But I underestimated the demons my father had seen in her from the beginning. Once she decided I was the enemy, she wasn't about to let me win without a fight. The more she fought, though, the worse things got for her, and the angrier she became. That included another arrest, this time for possession of marijuana, which came with a hefty fine and a 6-month suspension of her driver's license. By the time midsummer rolled around, I finally got the divorce I'd been fighting for. Then we headed to court over custody, and she tried to bring out what she thought was her big weapon, the fact that I'd been the one who introduced her to drugs in the first place. But my lawyer countered with the evidence I'd collected, showing I'd been clean for almost a year. It looked like full custody was within my reach. Then Rachel finally crossed the line. It was a sweltering night in September, and I was just leaving the store. The only warning I had was the sound of footsteps shuffling toward me. Suddenly, I felt a hard blow, a bat or maybe a heavy stick, slam into my ribs. I managed to roll away just in time to avoid a second hit aimed at my head, which ended up glancing off my shoulder. I scrambled to my knees, trying to defend myself, and saw that I was being attacked by 3 guys. 2 of them I recognized from the video of Rachel's Christmas Eve escapade. I focused on the guy swinging the bat, keeping him from landing a solid hit on me, and I managed to get a few punches into his midsection. But in doing so, I left myself wide open to the fists and feet of the other 2. I don't know if they were trying to kill me or not, but I faintly heard voices approaching from down the street, and that's when they left me in a heap of pain. The last thing I remember before blacking out was a kid standing over me, asking if I was okay and calling for help. When I came to, I saw a face, a woman's face. At first, everything was blurry, but as my head started to clear, I realized she was a nurse, and a very pretty one at that. She had a slender face, but when she smiled at seeing me come around, her whole face lit up. That was how I met Kate Harding. I ended up spending 3 weeks in the hospital, and during that time, I got to know Kate pretty well. She was, without a doubt, the most beautiful woman I'd ever laid eyes on. She carried herself with a quiet grace, an elegance that seemed to come from a deep sense of inner peace. Kate was a little taller than average, slim, with soft blonde hair cut just above her shoulders. She wasn't particularly busty, but if that bothered her, she didn't show it, and it certainly didn't bother me. From the beginning, I felt a connection between us. We'd chat while she took care of me, and I quickly realized she was not only a great listener but also incredibly wise for her age. Kate was about a year older than me. She'd never been married, never even come close. She told me she'd had a few boyfriends, but none that really made her heart race. Then she flashed me that megawatt smile of hers and winked. While I was recovering, the police came by several times to talk to me, and it quickly became clear that the attack had been orchestrated by none other than my ex-wife. I couldn't fathom why, but Rachel and her goons were arrested and charged with attempted murder. I let her sit in jail for a few months, sweating it out. Then, at the beginning of the following year, I met with her to cut a deal. I told her that if she gave up all custody claims, I'd see about getting her charges reduced to aggravated assault. "Why should I help you?" she snapped. "Because I doubt you want to spend the next 15 years in prison," I replied calmly. "I'm offering you a chance, 3 to 6 years with the possibility of supervised visits with the kids, or 15 to life, where you'll never see them again. Don't make the same mistake twice, Rachel. Remember, I would have overlooked everything if you'd just done what I asked, if you'd quit that job, gone to rehab, and taken counseling seriously. But you didn't, and look where that got you. You're unemployed, still hooked on drugs, and about to become a convicted felon. You've got nothing on me," she spat. "Oh, really?" I said, a sneer creeping across my face. I was done letting her walk all over me. "You should hear what your friends are saying. They're telling the cops you hired them to attack me. They're saying you wanted me dead. They're rolling on you, Rachel, and your only chance is to make a deal." I watched her shoulders slump as the weight of the situation hit her. In the end, Rachel finally caved. She struck a deal with the DA and pleaded guilty to aggravated assault. She was sentenced to 3 to 6 years, and with that, I was rid of her for good, or at least as much as I could be. But by that point, I was left completely drained, financially and emotionally. I had to sell the house and move back in with my parents, along with the kids. My mom was a godsend, stepping in to help with the kids and doing her best to soothe their fears. After getting out of the hospital, I still had 2 more months of physical therapy, during which I couldn't work. Thankfully, I was covered by the company's insurance, and I received workers' comp, but the new year was fast approaching, and the store needed a manager on site. Compared to the disaster of the previous year, New Year's 1992 was much quieter. Still, it only served to remind me of just how lonely I was. The woman I had once thought I loved, the mother of my children, had turned into my sworn enemy and completely destroyed her own life in the process. Money was tight, and I couldn't provide for the kids the way I wanted to. On top of that, I was still in pain and slipping into a deep depression over everything that had gone wrong in the past 18 months. And then things got worse. After the first of the year, the company I'd been with gave me an ultimatum: either take a manager's position in another state or accept a layoff. Neither option appealed to me, so I resigned and took a job working the floor at a big retail store. It was a significant step down from a manager's role, and the pay was much lower than what I had been making. It felt like I was starting my career all over again. But the work was easy, and the hours were manageable, allowing me to be home in the evenings with my kids. I rented a small house in a low-rent neighborhood, and we moved out of my parents' place. It wasn't much, but it was our home for the time being. All in all, that winter of 1993 was the lowest point of my life. The only silver lining was that I managed to resist the temptation of drugs and alcohol. After watching Rachel spiral into self-destruction, I knew better than to follow that path. But I'd be lying if I said I wasn't tempted at times. Then, out of nowhere, an angel crossed my path for the second time. It happened on a Saturday. I was at the grocery store with the kids, and they were being a handful. By then, they were 8, 6, and 5, and while they were good kids, they were still kids. I was in the middle of dealing with Nathan, who was acting out, when I heard a familiar voice from behind me. "Mark Turner," came the voice. I turned around, and there she was, Kate, walking toward us with a warm smile. We hugged, and then she crouched down to greet all three of the kids by name. I was stunned. She'd only met them once or twice, yet she remembered their names and ages. That was the first time I realized how gifted she was with children because they instantly calmed down. We chatted for a bit, and she seemed genuinely concerned about how I was doing. Then, as we looked up at the same time, our eyes locked. It was just for a brief moment, but in that moment, I think we both felt something, a spark. "Hey, would you like to grab dinner sometime?" I asked, feeling a little unsure. "I mean, I owe you for all the care you gave me when I was in the hospital." "Mark, I was just doing my job," Kate replied with a smile, "but I have to say it was a pleasure. And I'd love to go out with you. Are you free tonight?" I was caught off guard. Later, I'd learned that's just how Kate is, direct and to the point, without any pretense. We exchanged phone numbers, and she gave me a light kiss on the cheek before we parted. It was nothing major, but it sent a wave of goosebumps across my skin. Little Sarah, sharp as ever, noticed right away. As we were finishing up our shopping, she blurted it out. "Is she going to be our new mommy?" Sarah asked me, her eyes wide with curiosity. "I don't know, sweetheart," I replied with a smile. "It's way too soon to say. But would you like her to be your new mommy?" "Oh, yes," she said, grinning happily. I turned to Emily and Nathan. "What about you guys? You think you could accept Miss Kate as your new mommy?" "Sure, Dad," Nathan said. "She's pretty cool." I laughed. "Well, we'll see. It's early days, and she might have something to say about it too." "But you like her, don't you, Daddy?" Emily asked in her usual quiet, thoughtful way. "Yeah, I do," I admitted. "But like I said, we've got a long road ahead before we reach that point." That night, I took Kate out to a steakhouse. Nothing fancy, just a place with a cozy atmosphere and good food. Over dinner, I realized how different she was from Rachel, everything Rachel wasn't. I can't say Kate is perfect because, like anyone, she has her moments. But I've never met anyone with such a positive outlook on life, someone who could light up a room with just her presence. With Rachel, it always felt like doom and gloom were lurking around every corner. She'd spend so much energy worrying about things she couldn't control, dwelling on the past and filled with regret. That kind of thinking had always pulled me down with her. But Kate? She was the complete opposite. Every day was a fresh start, a new opportunity. She was someone who looked forward, who planned, who never wasted a second dwelling on yesterday. When a day ended, it was over for her. She only brought up the past if it was absolutely necessary. It didn't take long before we both knew we were falling in love, and fast. After about 6 weeks of dating, I introduced her to my family. They were smitten with her. My dad, in particular, pulled me aside after meeting her and told me, "Do whatever you have to do to keep her." The kids, of course, had already fallen for Kate, and she slipped into a motherly role so naturally. As summer rolled on, we became more intimate, though we both held back from taking things further, at least for a while. After everything I'd been through with Rachel, I was hesitant to let myself get too deep emotionally. And Kate wasn't the type to engage in casual sex. "One day, when I make love with you, I want it to be more than just a physical act," she said one evening as we sat on the sofa at my house after dinner, a regular occurrence by then. "I want it to be the sealing of a bond of love." "I love you, Mark," she continued, but I don't want us to do this until we're both ready, until we know this is going to be a long-term commitment. She explained that she had given her virginity away back in college to a guy she thought she was in love with, only to have her heart broken. Since then, she had waited for the right man. "I think you're that man," she said, "but I want us to be sure. I want you to be ready to take that final step with me." "God, Kate, I do want you," I said, feeling a surge of emotion. "But you have no idea how much it means to me to hear you say that. After what I went through with Rachel, hearing a woman equate sex with love is like music to my ears." "Soon, my love," she whispered, leaning in to kiss me deeply and slowly. A week or so later, I went to my mother and told her I was planning to ask Kate to marry me. My mom did something she had never done for Rachel, probably because my first marriage had been rushed and forced. She went to her bedroom, opened her jewelry box, and pulled out her engagement ring. With tears in her eyes, she handed it to me. "Give this to her with my blessing," she said softly. "It's not a fancy diamond, just a small stone in a simple setting. But I have a feeling that with her, it will mean so much more than some expensive, shiny new ring. There's a lot of love in this ring, and I want her to have it. She's the best thing that's ever happened to you, and I want her to know that." I decided Christmas Eve would be the perfect time to make my move. The plan was to do Santa Claus at my parents' house, where the kids could enjoy their presents with their cousins and grandparents, and then, I wanted the night alone with Kate. After work, I picked her up from the hospital and headed over to my folks' house to gather the kids for the Christmas Eve service at the church where Kate had been a long-time member and where I'd started attending. Kate sang in the choir that night, and as I watched her, I found myself lost in her eyes, completely captivated by the way she looked at me while she sang. Later, after we managed to get the kids to bed, no easy feat, we laid out the Santa gifts. Once that was done, I told my parents that Kate and I were heading back to my place. I winked at my mom, letting her know without words what I had planned for the evening. At the house, I turned on the lights of the Christmas tree and put some holiday music on the stereo. We settled on the sofa, and that's when I reached into the cushions and pulled out the small box I had hidden. "Kate, I've got a special Christmas gift for you, and I want you to open it now," I said softly. I handed her the box, and as soon as she opened it, her eyes widened, and her mouth fell open in surprise and joy. "Kate, will you marry me?" Her answer came in the form of kisses, soft, warm, and full of love. Our hands began to explore each other, and this time, we didn't stop. We knew the moment had arrived. "God, I've wanted this for so long. Love me, Mark. Please," she whispered. "Believe me, I've wanted it even longer," I replied. We made love, and afterward, we lay there, staring into each other's eyes. Words weren't necessary, everything we felt was communicated in that silent, intimate gaze. "Merry Christmas, my love," she whispered. "Merry Christmas to you, love," I whispered back. Kate and I were married at our church in mid-March, and since then, we've shared nearly 15 years of wedded bliss. My children became hers in every way that mattered, and they took to their new mommy like ducks to water. But life hasn't been without its challenges. The first dark cloud came when we realized that Kate wouldn't be able to give me a child of our own. We tried everything, but eventually, we learned that she had an issue with her uterus. In typical Kate fashion, she didn't dwell on her own disappointment. Instead, she focused on raising the children we already had, never letting her personal struggles affect the love and care she gave them. The second dark moment came about 6 years into our marriage. Out of the blue, I got a call from Rachel. She told me that she had contracted HIV years earlier and was now dying of AIDS. After getting out of prison, she had ended up on the streets, turning tricks, and now she was in hospice. She asked to see the children before she passed. I dreaded the visit, but strangely, when I saw her, Rachel seemed to have found some peace with herself, and with me. She no longer held me responsible for all the bad things that had happened in her life. She forgave me for my mistakes during our marriage, and I forgave her for all the hell she put me through during the divorce. After meeting with the kids, Rachel asked to speak to Kate alone. When Kate came out, her eyes were filled with tears. Later, as we drove home, she told me a little about their conversation. She told me not to let you go, Kate said quietly. She said her biggest mistake was not listening to you when you gave her the chance to fix things and save the marriage. She knows she blew it, and that's why she was so bitter about the divorce. The last thing Rachel did before she passed away was grant Kate permission to adopt the children. She had resisted it for years, holding on to bitterness and anger. But in the end, she did the right thing, giving the love of my life the opportunity to become the mother she was always meant to be. With Kate by my side, I was able to bounce back into management quickly, eventually rising through the ranks to a position in the corporate office. Now, I'm a regional director for the company I work for, and I've done pretty well for myself. Kate is still a nurse, working in pediatrics, where her special gifts are needed the most. Some of the cases she handles break her heart, and others ignite her outrage. She does have a temper, though you'd never know it. She's excellent at keeping it under wraps. Emily was so inspired by her stepmother that she decided to follow in her footsteps and pursue a career in nursing. Nathan is still in college, and right after high school, he joined the Army National Guard. I worry sometimes, especially with the war in Iraq dragging on, that he might get called up, but that's his choice, and I'll support him no matter what. Sarah is in college too, with plans to become a teacher. It's been a good life, a fulfilling life. One I doubt I would have had if Kate hadn't walked into my world when she did. Santa's gifts are all set out, and Kate is curled up beside me on the sofa, resting comfortably in my arms. Bing Crosby's White Christmas plays softly in the background, and we gaze at the fire as it slowly dies down. I take the last sip of my drink and set the glass on the coffee table. Tomorrow will bring laughter, excitement, and the joy of watching the family open the gifts we've picked out for each other. We'll tear into packages, marvel at the thought behind every gift, and eventually gather in the kitchen to prepare the holiday meal. It'll be a day filled with happiness, like every Christmas has been since Kate came into our lives. But tonight, in the stillness of Christmas Eve, I take a moment to reflect on the greatest gift I've ever received, the one that keeps on giving. Tonight, I bask in the warmth of Kate's love and devotion, and in the deep sense of commitment and love I've been able to return to her over the years. Grace is more than just elegance. It's an unearned gift from God, and that's exactly what Kate has been for me, my grace, my gift.